I know now what was waiting for me in Thornfield because it told me. Not with words, not at first, but with my mother's voice, calling my name from the tree line at 3:47 in the morning, 3 days after I buried her. I didn't answer. I couldn't, because my mother had been dead for 11 years, and the voice that came from between those black trees was wrong in ways I'm still not equipped to describe. It sounded like her, yes, her cadence, her slight wheeze, the particular way she stretched the second syllable of my name like she was pulling it from somewhere deep inside herself. But beneath that approximation ran something else. Something that moved through the sound like a parasite through flesh. The voice wanted me to turn around. It wanted me to walk into those trees and keep walking until the town of Thornfield swallowed me whole. I stood on the porch of the rental cabin with my phone pressed against my chest, watching the space between the pines where the voice had come from, and I understood with terrible clarity that I had made a terrible mistake coming here. The decision to scatter my mother's ashes in Thornfield, Vermont, had seemed right when I made it. Practical, even. She'd been born there, spent her first 6 years in that town before her family moved west, and she'd talked about those early childhood years my entire life with a fondness that bordered on obsession. I found the birth certificate while cleaning out her apartment after the cancer finally took her. I found the address of the general store she'd spoken of, the church where her father had preached, the cemetery where her baby brother was buried, stillborn, a footnote in a family Bible she kept in a locked box beneath her bed. I was grieving. I know that now. I was 43 years old, childless, recently divorced, and the only family I'd ever known had just died in a hospice bed while I held her hand and pretended to be stronger than I was. The grief counselor said I was processing well. The grief counselor had never been to Thornfield. I drove up on a Thursday in late October, when the leaves had turned but hadn't yet fallen, and the mountains looked like they were bleeding rust and gold into the valley below. The GPS lost signal about 15 miles outside of town, which I attributed to the terrain. Cell service was spotty at best once I got closer, another thing I didn't think twice about. I'd come prepared with printed directions, a paper map, and enough cash to last a week if I needed it. The town of Thornfield appeared without warning, which should have been my first sign. One moment I was winding through state forests on a two-lane highway with no shoulder. The next I was rolling past a wooden sign that said Welcome to Thornfield, AST 1742, and then immediately into the main street, which consisted of perhaps 12 buildings arranged around a central green that was more brown than green, more dead than dormant. It was 4 in the afternoon, and the streets were empty. I parked in front of what appeared to be the general store, a converted colonial with a faded sign and windows so grimy I couldn't see inside. The other buildings were equally silent. A church with a steeple that listed slightly to the left, a post office that looked like it hadn't been opened in years, a diner with chrome stools visible through a fogged window, and several residential houses set back from the road with their curtains drawn tight. No people, no cars, no dogs or cats or birds. Just the wind moving through the dead leaves on the pavement, and the sound of my own breathing too loud in my ears. I told myself it was off-season. I told myself it was a weekday, that people worked, that mountain towns had their own rhythms, that I was projecting my city-born anxieties onto a place that simply moved slower than I was used to. I almost believed it. The general store was open, though the hours posted on the door said it should have closed 20 minutes ago. I pushed inside and a bell chimed overhead, a thin, tinny sound that seemed to startle someone in the back of the shop. A woman emerged from a doorway behind the counter, and I felt the weight of her gaze before I really saw her face. She was perhaps 60, with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes the color of creek water in winter, pale and flat and unreadable. She looked at me the way you might look at something you'd found in your pantry that shouldn't be there. "Help you?" she asked. Her voice was flat, affectless, as if the words were a script she'd memorized long ago and saw no reason to perform with feeling. "I'm looking for the old Morrison place," I said. I'd found the property records online, traced the ownership through 3 generations before it ended up in my mother's name when her father died in 1987. The town had never notified her. The taxes had gone unpaid for decades. I was here, in part, to deal with that. It's about 10 acres off Route 9, near the old cemetery. The woman's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. Something that looked almost like pity. "You're one of the Halworth girls," she said. Not a question. My mother was. Eleanor Halworth. She was born here in 52. "I know who you are." The woman came around the counter slowly, with the deliberate care of someone navigating a room full of breakable objects. She stopped about 6 feet from me, close enough that I could smell her, liniment and something else, something that reminded me of the basement smell in my grandmother's house, earthy and closed in. "Your grandmother was a strange woman. Your mother, too, before she left. Strange families, the Halworths." "I'm sorry, do I know you?" "No." She shook her head once, sharply. "But I know you're kind. You came to dig up what's buried, didn't you? That's what your mother did. That's what her mother did before her. The Halworth women always come back to dig." The silence stretched between us, thick and somehow accusatory. I felt my face flush. "I just want to scatter some ashes," I said. "That's all. My mother loved this place. She talked about it constantly. I thought it would be peaceful here. Meaningful." The woman studied me for a long moment, and something in her expression softened almost imperceptibly. "The Morrison place is still standing," she said finally. "Needs work, but it's standing. You can stay there if you want. It's yours, after all. But I'll give you the same advice I give everyone who comes up here looking for Halworth business." She leaned closer, and I could see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes. The way her skin seemed too thin over her cheekbones, like paper stretched over bone. "Stay away from the tree line after dark. Stay away from the old burial ground. And whatever you do, don't answer if something calls your name from those woods. It won't be human." She said it simply, matter-of-factly, the way you might say don't forget your umbrella or watch your step. And then she walked back behind the counter and disappeared into the doorway she'd come from, leaving me alone in the store with the dust motes drifting through the failing light from the windows. I waited for her to come back. 5 minutes. 10. I called out once, twice, and heard nothing but the creak of the building settling around me, the distant groan of wind through the gaps in the walls. The front door was behind me, but I couldn't remember turning the deadbolt, and when I tried the handle it wouldn't budge. I don't know how long I stood there, pulling on a door that wouldn't open, before I finally turned and saw that there was another door in the shop, one I hadn't noticed before, half hidden behind a shelf of canned goods. It was slightly ajar, and beyond it I could see nothing but darkness. I left through that door. I don't remember deciding to. One moment I was at the front entrance, and the next I was pushing through into the cold October air, standing in an alley I hadn't seen from the street, with my bag over my shoulder and the general store at my back. When I looked back, there was no door, just the grimy window and the faded sign and the dead leaves swirling against the foundation. The Morrison place was exactly where the directions said it would be, set back about a quarter mile from the highway down a dirt road that hadn't been maintained in decades. The cabin itself was smaller than I'd expected, a 2-room structure with a loft, built sometime in the 1800s from logs that had grayed to the color of old bone. It sat in a small clearing, and behind it, perhaps 50 yards away, I could see the edge of the tree line where the forest began its steady climb up the mountain. The interior was dusty but intact. A wood-burning stove in the main room, a hand pump for water in the kitchen corner, a ladder leading up to a loft bedroom that looked out over the trees. Someone had been here recently. There were fresh matches on the stove, a stack of firewood by the hearth, and on the kitchen counter, a single glass of water, that condensation still beating on the outside. I woke at 3:47 with my heart slamming against my ribs and my mother's voice still echoing in my ears. And through the window, I saw something standing in the clearing. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to bend at angles that shouldn't work, joints moving in directions human knees and elbows don't go. Its skin was the color of bark, or maybe it was bark, textured and ridged and streaked with something dark that might have been dried sap, or might have been something else. It had no face that I could see, just a smooth expanse where features should be, but I knew with absolute certainty that it was looking at me. It was looking at me, and it was smiling, because the blank expanse of its face was cracked open in a way that suggested pleasure, anticipation, hunger. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I could only watch as it stood there in the moonlight, its head tilting slowly to the side like a dog studying something it doesn't quite understand, and then it lifted one of its arms, its long, too many jointed arm, and it pointed at me. And it spoke. "Caroline," it said, and the voice was my mother's voice, and the voice was the woman's voice from the store, and beneath all of that was something ancient and cold and utterly inhuman, something that had been waiting in this town for a very long time, and had finally found someone worth talking to. "Caroline, I've been so lonely." I found my voice then. I don't know where it came from, some animal instinct that bypassed thought entirely, and I screamed. I screamed until my throat tore, and the thing in the clearing turned and walked, not ran, walked, into the trees with that same terrible patience. And by the time I scrambled down the ladder and burst out the front door, there was nothing there but the moonlight and the dead leaves and the absolute silence of a forest that had seen everything and would tell me nothing. I should have left. I know that now. I should have gotten in my car and driven back to Portland and scattered my mother's ashes somewhere safe, anywhere but here, and tried to forget the tall thing in the clearing and the way it said my name. But I didn't. I told myself it was a hallucination, a nightmare, a breakdown brought on by grief and exhaustion. I told myself the stress of the move, the divorce, the slow horror of watching my mother die had finally cracked something in my mind, and what I needed was rest, closure, the completion of the task I'd come here to perform. I told myself I was rational. I told myself I was fine. I was neither. The second day, I walked to the cemetery. The old burial ground was exactly where my mother had described it, on a slight rise about a mile from the cabin, surrounded by a rusted iron fence that had collapsed in places and grown over completely in others. The stones were old, very old, some of them so weathered the names had worn away to nothing, just vague shapes where letters used to be. I found my great-uncle's grave easily. A small stone marker with the name Thomas Morrison and the dates 1952 to 1952, just 6 days between birth and death. Beside it was a larger stone for his mother, Margaret Morrison, 1915 to 1987, and beside her, another for James Morrison, 1909 to 1976. My grandmother. I'd never met her. She died before I was born, and my mother never spoke of her except to say that she'd been a strange woman, a religious woman, a woman who saw things that weren't there and heard things that couldn't be said. I spread my mother's ashes there, in the shadow of her grandmother's grave, and I said the words I'd prepared and the words I hadn't, and when I was done I sat on the cold ground, and I cried for the first time since the hospice, great heaving sobs that felt like they would tear something loose inside me. The sun was setting. The shadows were getting long. And when I finally looked up, I saw them standing at the edge of the cemetery. There were 3 of them. Tall figures that might have been human if you didn't look too close, if you didn't notice the way their heads were slightly too large, their fingers slightly too long, their movements slightly too smooth. They didn't speak. They didn't move. They just stood there at the tree line, watching me, and I understood with terrible clarity that they had been watching me since I arrived, that they had been waiting for this moment, that my mother had sent me here for a reason I was only beginning to suspect. I ran. I ran through the cemetery and out onto the road, and all the way back to the cabin. And when I got there, I locked the door and barred the windows and sat in the corner of the main room with my knife in my hand and my heart trying to escape from my chest. That night, they came again. Not the tall one from before. Other ones, smaller, faster, things that moved through the trees around the cabin with sounds like branches breaking and leaves rustling, and something almost like laughter, high and thin and utterly wrong. They circled the cabin for hours. They scratched at the walls. They called my name in voices that sounded like everyone I'd ever lost. My mother, my grandmother, a boy I'd dated in college who died in a car accident, my father who'd left when I was 7 and never came back. They called and called and called, and every voice was wrong somehow, stretched and distorted like a record played at the wrong speed, and I covered my ears and hummed and prayed for morning. When the sun finally rose, they were gone. But on the wooden wall of the cabin, just below the window, I found marks. Deep gouges in the soft pine, arranged in a pattern that might have been writing in a language I couldn't read, or might have been nothing at all. I touched the marks with my fingertips and felt something move beneath my skin, a vibration, a resonance, a welcome. I spent the third day in the cabin, too terrified to leave. I ate the last of my sandwiches. I drank the water from the glass on the counter, which I now realized had been there before I arrived, which meant someone or something had been inside while I stood frozen in the general store. I tried to call Rachel again, but there was no signal, and when I checked the battery on my phone I saw that it was at 1%, even though I'd charged it the night before. That evening, just after sunset, there was a knock on the door. I didn't answer. I sat very still in the corner, my knife in my hand, and listened to the knock come again and again and again. It wasn't aggressive. It was patient, almost gentle, the way you might knock on a friend's door. The way you might knock on the door of someone you wanted to come inside. Caroline. It was the woman from the store. I knew it wasn't really her. I could see her shape through the window, her gray hair and pale eyes and the terrible, terrible smile on her face. But the voice was hers, and it was kind, and it was worried, and it wanted to know if I was all right. Caroline, you've been in there for 2 days. I'm worried about you. Let me in. I didn't answer. I pressed my hand over my mouth to keep from making any sound, and I watched through the window as the woman's shape shifted and changed, as it grew taller and thinner, and its limbs bent in ways they shouldn't, as the pale eyes blazed with something that might have been frustration or might have been amusement. Suit yourself, it said, and the voice was no longer the woman's voice at all, but something else, something that had been wearing her face since I walked into her store. I'll come back tomorrow. I always come back. That's the thing about this place, Caroline. This place doesn't let go. It holds on. It waits. And eventually, everyone here becomes part of the forest. I heard it walk away. I heard the trees creak and groan as it passed through them. And then there was silence. And then there was the sound of my own breathing. And then there was the sound of something else, something above me, on the roof, something heavy and patient that moved with slow, deliberate steps from one side of the cabin to the other. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my corner, and I watched the ceiling, and I listened to the thing that was walking above me. And I understood finally what my mother had been hiding all her life, what her own mother had been hiding, what the women in my family had been running from for generations. We weren't visitors here. We were offerings. On the 4th day, I tried to leave. I made it as far as the main road before I saw them. They were standing in the middle of the asphalt, a dozen of them or more, tall and thin and tilted at angles that suggested they didn't quite understand how human bodies were supposed to work. They were wearing faces, faces I recognized, faces from the store and the cemetery and my own memory, faces that belonged to people who had lived in this town and disappeared into its trees and come back wrong. My mother's face was among them. It smiled at me. The thing wearing my mother's face smiled at me with too many teeth, with a mouth that opened too wide, and then it spoke in my mother's voice and said, "You came back to me, baby. You came home." I turned and ran. I ran back to the cabin, and I barricaded myself inside, and I pressed my back against the wall, and I sobbed until there was nothing left in me, until I was hollow and empty and so very, very tired. That was when I found the journal. It was in a box beneath the floorboards in the bedroom, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the decades. The cover was leather, worn soft with age, and on the first page, in handwriting I recognized from my grandmother's letters, were the words, "For Eleanor, when she's ready. Believe everything it tells you." I read it through the night, by the light of the dying fire, and by the time the sun rose I understood everything. My grandmother had been right. The Haworth women always came back to dig. Not to dig up graves, but to dig up truth. Truth about what lived in these woods, what had always lived in these woods, what would continue to live here long after the last human had fled or been consumed. The thing in the forest was old. Older than the town, older than the trees, older than the mountains themselves. It was hunger given form, a presence that fed on fear and faith, and the particular kind of loneliness that only comes when you know you are being watched, and there is nothing you can do about it. My grandmother had made a deal with it. That's what the journal said. She had been young and desperate and pregnant with my mother, and the thing had appeared to her in the form of her own dead mother and offered her a bargain. Stay in Thornfield, bear your daughter here, raise her here, and in return, the thing would let her live. It would let her daughter live. It would wait and watch, and eventually, when the time was right, it would come to collect what was owed. My grandmother had accepted. She raised my mother in this cabin, taught her to fear the tree line, told her stories about the things that lived in the forest until my mother believed them so thoroughly that she ran away at 16, never to return. My mother had tried to escape. She'd moved across the country, changed her name, built a life that had nothing to do with the town and the mountains that had stolen her childhood. She'd had me, raised me, loved me, and never once told me what waited here. But the thing didn't forget. The thing never forgot. And when my mother died, when the cancer ate through her lungs and liver and finally her brain, she came back, not in body, but in the way the journal described, in the way the thing always claimed its vessels. My mother's death had been the payment. Her ashes had been the key. And I, her only child, the last of the Haworth line, was the final installment. I was the offering. I had been since the moment I was born. The journal had instructions. That's what my grandmother was, in the end, a pragmatist, a woman who knew she was damning her daughter, but did it anyway because the alternative was worse. The journal told me what would happen if I stayed, and what would happen if I tried to leave, and what might happen if I did exactly what the thing wanted. It said, let it in. Let it wear your face. Let it walk through the world in your body, speaking with your voice, loving with your hollow heart. It said, the thing doesn't want to kill you. It wants to become you. It wants to wear your skin and live your life and be loved by the people you left behind. It said, there is no escape, only transformation. And transformation, in its own way, is a kind of survival. It said, write this down. Write everything down. So that someday, someone will find it. So that someday, someone will know the truth about Thornfield and the thing that waits in its trees. I spent the 5th day writing. I wrote what happened in the store, what happened in the cemetery, what happened in the clearing at 3:47 in the morning. I wrote about the faces and the voices and the terrible patience of something that had been waiting my entire life for me to come home. I wrote about my mother and my grandmother and the long chain of women who had been claimed by this place, and I wrote about the deal that was made, and the price that was paid, and the debt that was finally due. I wrote this for you. I write it now, in the last light of the 5th day, while the sun sets over the mountains and the shadows grow long, and the thing that will soon be me stands at the edge of the clearing, waiting. It told me its name today, not in words. I don't think it has words, not really, but in the way it moved through my mind, in the cold presence that pressed against my thoughts like fingers against glass. It doesn't have a name the way we have names. It has a purpose, a function, a hunger that can never be satisfied. But it showed me what it was before the forest, before the mountains, before the town was built, and the first Haworth woman arrived, and made the bargain that would echo through generations. It was a child once, a very long time ago. It was a child who was lost in these woods and was never found, and something else found it instead. Something that was already here, already waiting, already hungry. It took the child, and it wore the child, and it grew into the thing that I see now when I look at the tree line, and it has been wearing faces ever since. It wore my mother's face when it called to me from the trees. It wore the woman's face in the store. It will wear my face when it walks out of these woods and back into the world, and no one will know the difference. They will see me. Rachel will see me. My colleagues will see me. The barista at the coffee shop will see me, and they will think I am whole. I am well. I am the Caroline they knew before I came to Thornfield. But I will be gone. I will be here, in the forest, in the thing that wears my face, in the hunger that can never be satisfied. I will be the cold presence at the edge of vision, the wrongness that people feel but can't name, the fear that comes when you are alone and something watches from the dark. This is the 6th day. The sun has set. The thing is at the door. I can hear it scratching, gently, patiently, the way a dog scratches when it wants to come inside. I can hear it breathing, slow and deep and utterly inhuman, a sound like wind through dead branches, like the last exhale of something that died a very long time ago. It is patient. It has always been patient. It waited for my grandmother and my mother and me. It will wait for the next one and the one after that, and all the Halworth women who will come to Thornfield to dig up what was buried. I am going to open the door now. I am going to let it in. And when I walk out of this cabin tomorrow, I will be wearing my own face, and I will be going home. I'm so tired. I've been so tired since I got here. And the thing at the door is so patient and so kind, and it promises that the hunger will stop if I just let it in, if I just become part of the forest, if I just stop fighting. It's lying. I know it's lying. But I'm so tired, and the door is so close, and the scratching is so gentle, and I can hear my mother's voice now, telling me it's okay, telling me to come home, telling me that everything will be all right. I can hear Rachel's voice too, and my father's voice, and everyone I've ever loved, everyone I've ever lost, all calling to me from the tree line, all promising peace, all promising rest, all promising that the fear will stop if I just stop fighting. I'm going to open the door now. I'm so tired.